Absoluto bitte. Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom. Take your protein pills and put your helmet on. I'm not David Bowie. I've never been, except on stage in my... Do you think I might have one of my cigarettes? Thank you. Except on stage where I do a kind of cabaret act in which I am the incarnation of David Bowie. Today, as your lecturer, I wanted to talk about that act, but also my personal history with this singer who still appears to me every night in dreams. Not sure about last night, but the night before he was doing one of his death dives. He seems to be doing a death dive in my dreams just now. He's jumping out of a high place, and he always wants me to follow, as I have done most of my life, followed this guy. So it starts for me, I suppose, in the most miserable time of my life, which is the dormitories of my boarding school in Scotland, 1971. I wasn't really aware of Space Oddity the first time around in '69 when it was a hit. I mean, apparently it was used by the BBC to accompany the moon landings in '69. September '69, our family was actually in Montpellier, so I did watch the moon landings live on television in the grounds of the University of Montpellier, but it was the French TV coverage and they didn't use Bowie, so I didn't hear that then. I really come to that album via the repackagings of RCA in '72, post the success of Ziggy Stardust. So at boarding school, there was a kind of virus or meme amongst the cool kids in Mackenzie House. I was a member of the senior common room, which was up on the top of the building. It was this little den where a select group of maybe, I don't know, a dozen boarders were allowed to read books, listen to records. So I had a friend called Mark Hughes. Mark was sort of a good-looking guy who was, his family were in Nigeria. And he would go around saying things like "shaggy borao." This was some sort of swear word in Nigerian or something. Shaggy borao. And he would call me Poof. He just, every time he saw me, he called me Poof, but in a sort of affectionate way. Probably thought I was really a Poof. This was when I was having my affair with the Chinese boy. And I guess I was in the inversion period, what you'd call the inversion stage of psychosexual development, when everybody's kind of a bit gay, especially when you're in a boarding school and there are no girls. Of course, you have to become a bit gay, and all the boys had girls' names, and but it was also the time of glam rock, and the really hip records that year were... Okay, I'd been into T-Rex for a couple of years, and I was listening a lot to Electric Warrior, The Slider, and sort of the singles, the greatest hits, Telegram Sam and all that stuff, Get It On, Mark Bolan, this very sexual boogie music with sort of slightly whimsical lyrics. But when I heard... Well, okay, the virus or meme in the boarding house, in the dormitories, like Mark Hughes and other boys, Callum Campbell was another of the really good-looking, tough guys. He wasn't in the senior common room, Mark Hughes was. Huggett, we called Hughes. They would go around singing this line from the Ziggy Stardust song, which was in the charts. So where were the spiders while the fly tried to break our balls? So this became a sort of... How could you sing that, a line about balls, you know, in the charts? How was that allowed? But also I wondered, when I finally heard it, I think I heard it on a transistor radio in C-dorm or E-dorm. Transistor radios were not allowed, but somehow there was one playing there. I thought, how can that be a man's voice? It's too high. It's just inhumanly high. It sounded like a robotic kind of otherworldly voice. The moment everyone's supposed to remember is the moment he appeared on Top of the Pops doing Starman. I'm not sure I do remember that. I may have seen that. We were allowed to watch TV down in the common room. But that's not really a moment I particularly remember. What I remember is just hearing people echoing this line about the fly trying to break our balls. And it's funny because the early T-Rex records had a fly on the label, and maybe Bowie resented the fact that Mark Bolan, who he was mates with, had succeeded a couple of years in advance of him and was trying to break his balls. But the next thing that happened was that Huggett's sister lent him 4 albums of David Bowie, and that was the first, the RCA repackages. So it was Ziggy Stardust, Space Oddity, Hunky Dory, and what would be the other one? Gosh, maybe it's just those 3. The Man Who Sold the World, of course. So it was my privilege to sit there in the senior common room listening to these. I was allowed to read the lyric sheet while I was listening. This was sort of handed in a magnanimous way to me. I then I had this weird thing where I was on hunger strike in boarding school, and I really, it was also the time of ultra-violence, and I was reading, Clockwork Orange, but also J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, all this sort of rebellious literature, and being a kind of rebel, but also very sorry for myself. So I was actually on a hunger strike for a while to try to get my parents to take me out of the school. It was either that or commit suicide or run away or something, but I decided just not to eat any food. But then I sort of broke my promise and queued up in the tuck queue for some confectionery, and was sort of pulled out of the tuck queue by the housemaster and told that my parents had complained that I was on hunger strike. So that got me in trouble, and he said, if this happens again, you'll be kicked out of the senior common room. This was the threat held over me. And so I then got in trouble a second time because I skipped tea. When all the other boys went across to the refectory to have their awful meal of baked beans and cups of tea and things, I stayed in the music rooms with a secret transistor radio, listening to the rundown, Top of the Pops rundown this would have been 73, To Hear Drive-In Saturday, a song I was hearing for the first time with this. And then I saw the housemaster. He was coming through. You could see out of the windows of the piano rehearsal room, you could see the corridors of the rest of the building, and he saw me seeing him, and he came in and said, "What are you doing here? You should be at tea. This is a very serious thing." Serious not just because of skipping and listening to a transistor, but also because of my previous hunger strike, which made it really serious. That it looked like a second attempt to blackmail my parents to take me out of the school. So he said, "Okay, this time you're kicked out of the senior common room." So that suspension lasted a few weeks, and it was a suspension from being able to listen to records, and particularly David Bowie records. I wasn't really interested in any other records at that point. It was, I guess, Transformer became like the fifth of those 4 albums, the 5th record, and I recall listening to Transformer and also I guess a bit Jesus Christ Superstar, a bit less cool, but the rock operas of Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, which in some ways set the template for Ziggy Stardust. Ziggy Stardust is kind of like Jesus Christ Superstar transposed into the rock world. That's how I always think of it because of that context. So after that, I leave boarding school in 73. I remember Matron, seeing the gatefold sleeve to Aladdin Sane, Matron being absolutely scandalized by the full-length picture of Bowie sort of naked and airbrushed and with this funny little pool of liquid spilling down from the bones of his shoulders. Matron thinking this was absolutely scandalous and obviously very gay. It looked terribly gay. And this was a great thing about Bowie, that Bowie really put the fear of God, death, up the older generation. Fear of gayness, really, a fear of effeminacy, but also a sort of aggressive effeminacy and a visually very aggressive look. But of course, the songs were really what sold me. The fact I was also into, at the time, Mark Hughes actually was a bookbinder in his spare time, and he bound a copy of T.S. Eliot's collected poetry for me. And so I'd memorized things like The Wasteland as well. But Bowie's 5 Years, for instance, is very much like The Wasteland of T.S. Eliot to me. That's my wasteland, because it's very bleak but also sensual, and has this glamorous sense of fragmentation, which the early modernists also had. So I could be reading Proof Rock and The Wasteland, and then without much difficulty zap across to All the Madmen by David Bowie, or Andy Warhol. So this early manifestation of postmodernism worked very well with very early modernism. Somehow there's a rhyming of the concerns. Bowie was also reading Evelyn Waugh, and I was reading these Evelyn Waugh books at boarding school, Decline and Fall, and so on. And that sense of the 1920s decadence was very strong. So I responded to something which isn't really present in Mark Bolan, this sense of a sweeping vision of a fragmenting and crumbling society. The dates on the back of the Aladdin Sane album suggest that there's going to be a third world war in 1970, ? Something. Nobody expected us to, see the decade out. It was it's such an apocalyptic sense of a year zero almost, everything being... And you'd forgotten the Beatles, you'd forgotten all that 60s optimism and the flowery hippie mentality, and it was simply there were IRA bomb threats and actual bombs, and so when we left Britain, we emigrated to Canada, to Montreal in late 1973, and there was actually a bomb scare in the hotel the very night before we got the SS France at Southampton. We had to evacuate and stand on the street while the police searched the hotel. It was kind of like that, and shortly afterwards there was the 3-day week and all sorts of strikes and industrial unrest in Britain. So we got out at a good time, and Bowie also left, also on a ship. I think he also used the SS France, which we used, not the same voyage, but he tended to take these liners. So we had a 5-day crossing into the harbour of New York, Statue of Liberty, me and my brother in our sports jackets, seeing New York, which of course Bowie was starting to sing about and be fascinated by. Very, very impressive for somebody my age. And we went for dinner with the Yules, this family we'd been at boarding school with Doug Yule. Doug Yule? Who was a friend of my brother's, but Debbie, his sister Debbie, was someone that Mark Hughes had been trying to seduce, and I'd been used as a go-between because I was the most eloquent boy in the boarding school. I was writing the letters. I put aside this fake cigarette. I was writing her letters and signing them Mark Hughes, at his request. And so then we all went for lunch together, and I was sitting next to this girl who I'd been writing love letters to in someone else's name. By this time she'd had some sort of fizzled out, unsuccessful affair with him, and then she didn't really want to talk about him. But she did ask me, "Do you know Mark Hughes?" And I said, "Intimately." I just said that one word, intimately, and she must have thought I was just a fruit. So nothing more was said of it. But in the US, so the next few Bowie albums I buy are bought in America and or Canada rather. I guess the Fairview Shopping Centre in Montreal, Eaton's department store, I think it was, had a record department. So that's where I first saw Diamond Dogs, and that was sort of amazing to see that cover with the sort of fairground ambience, the freak show ambience of those kind of mental women in the background, and Bowie as a dog, a reclining dog, and to bring that home and to get the dog howl. My father absolutely appalled by the sound of this record, which again evokes the wasteland of T.S. Eliot for me, and in the death as the last few corpses lay rotting in the slimy thoroughfare. The shutters lifted an inch in Temperance Building, high on Poacher's Hill, and red mutant eyes gazed down on Hunger City. No more big wheels. Fleas the size of rats sucked on rats the size of cats, and 10,000 peopleoids split into small tribes, coveting the highest of the sterile skyscrapers like packs of dogs, looting the glass fronts of Love Me Avenue. Family badge of sapphire and cracked emerald, now leg warmers, all that stuff. Great fragmented, cut and paste, William Burroughs influenced, chopped up fragments of very evocative poetry. And Sweet Thing, fantastic. You know, that sort of symphonic approach to composition, where you get this slow bits and eerie bits, sinister bits, and then rocking bits, and then instrumental sections, and then funny kind of mellotron passages. That Zion section, do 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 do, which could be Elgar or something. So it's deeply imbued in me. But I also have this kind of I'm always trying to shrug things off which are too powerful. Like I resist alcohol, I resist television, I resist anything which is habit forming. Somehow becomes my enemy. So at the same time in the 70s, I'm trying to escape the influence of Bowie. And I'm always thinking, well, maybe this next record is one which I won't go along with, because he was changing so rapidly. So I missed the Diamond Dogs tour, which starts in Montreal in 1974. I'm not allowed, because my parents have seen on the TV news just how freaky these people look in the queue for the tickets. They're all Bowie freaks, and they all have painted faces and look dystopian in an exciting way. So a lot of kids at my school, MacDonald High School in Montreal, went to that show, the very opening of the Diamond Dogs tour, which doesn't exist on film or anything apparently. Very difficult to see now, except for in little clips like the BBC when they shot Cracked Out here, filmed bits of it. But I'm not allowed to. Madonna on that same tour, I heard the Detroit leg of that tour, actually defied this same order that she had from her parents not to go to the show. She actually jumped out the window of her bedroom and went downtown to see it. I should have done that if I'd had a bit more balls. Should have done it, but I didn't. So the next record is Young Americans. I guess by 75 we're back in Scotland. It somehow doesn't work out. We're nostalgic for our homeland, and we return from Montreal. And so I think I first saw Young Americans on the freeway driving down to Boston, but didn't buy it then, and got it finally when I was back in Edinburgh. I went to Bruce's record shop on Rose Street and bought a copy and taped it, and just, not even direct line taping, just taping with a microphone by the speakers, and took it back, because Bruce's had this deal where if you didn't like a record, you could take it back and exchange it for another. So I took it back and exchanged it for, I think, a copy of The Man Who Sold the World. I preferred the older Bowie with the more folksy sound. I didn't like this, the black sound, essentially, that he had, the Philly sound on Young Americans. It took me a while to really understand what he was doing with that, and to get into the whole white soul boy, plastic soul thing, which later became tremendously influential on me. You can hear it in songs like Ice King, or my whole kind of plastic folk phase is my attempt to do with folk music what he was doing with soul music. The idea of inauthenticity, plastic, blue-eyed, racial mix, but also kind of deliberate inauthenticity. And so I took it back, and I think I was a bit... I mean, I definitely got Station to Station. And I remember running in circles in our drum and place living room, and just go in endless circles, sort of singing these songs. Lord, singing in that sort of tremulando, melismatic tenor that he had. Lord, I kneel and offer you my word on a wing, all that stuff. Getting hyper emotional about it. That was the nice thing about Bowie. He had this image of being a sort of Iceman, but he was actually a hyper emotional singer, very, very strong emotions, even when singing about the absence of emotion, as he basically started doing on Low, or emptiness, a sort of Buddhistic emphasis on emptiness and inability to feel, which nevertheless becomes the most feelingful thing you can do. So it really confirms this saying of Adorno that in the end soul itself is the longing of the soul, less for redemption. So I was getting back on track with Station to Station, but I didn't really like its epic rock. I think I like Stay on that album. So, and then I somehow skipped Low when it came out in early '77. I didn't buy Low. What I bought was Heroes. I remember very distinctly, and it was the cover that really sold me. I went down to Rayburn Place. There was a record shop. There were record shops everywhere in Edinburgh in those days. I mean, basically every street had a record shop. So, and a little funky one as well, not these big mega stores that appeared later. So on Rayburn Place, I was flipping through the Bowie section, and there was this new album with Bowie doing this. And it was such a striking image. I just thought, wow, that looks amazing. It looks so dark. It had this sort of 1920s, almost a Chaplin or Buster Keaton kind of black and white grainy look to it, and with song titles like Sons of the Silent Age, Joe the Lion. It somehow had the feeling of a expressionist silent movie to it. Bowie had moved to Berlin. I hadn't really started reading the music papers. I think I'd probably bought Melody Maker when Bowie was interviewed by Michael, I can't remember, interviewed in a hotel room in Berlin with long curtains, I seem to remember, and Bowie is kind of, he's got his sort of moon boots on and a checked shirt, and he's doing sort of quite dramatic gestures, which Edwyn Collins would later copy of sort of looking very introverted, like that. And Heroes really hits home, and the whole idea of living in Berlin, having returned to Europe, really becomes tremendously important to me. Rejecting America and American values and coming to live in the center of Europe, I became fascinated with Europe from that point on. I was already listening a lot to Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk, in a sense, threatened to displace Bowie because their sound was so modern and so clean and melodic and beautiful, polished, that sort of rock sound could actually have simply died at that point. It could simply have seemed like an old-fashioned thing. But of course they were mentioning Bowie in their lyrics, you know, to Dusseldorf City, meet Iggy Pop and David Bowie. And Bowie was referencing them or referencing the whole of the German music scene in his new music. So there was this sense of he survived a possible cull. And then, of course, New Wave was happening, punk was happening, and he survived that as well by having worked so closely with Iggy, who was so crucial to the punks, touring with Iggy as his piano player and all the rest of it. This gave him a kind of kudos and credibility to the New Wavers as well. So the so-called post-punk bands like Magazine were hugely indebted to Bowie's 70s records. And when you listen, or Wire for that matter, 154 by Wire sounded like the album Bowie should have made, and was in fact reviewed at the time as the record Bowie should have made that year, 79 I think. And
Midnight at the theatre, news is coming over of the murder of the prophet, the one we all believed in. Everybody's scuttling and everybody's nervous. The man who makes the lightning has gone missing in the forest. And on the television comes the evil Nicky Dancho, who proclaims himself the regent, even though he is a rat. He's got forward sweeping eyebrows, an awful fearless forehead, and the scroll that he is holding tells the future of the world.
And if you listen to songs like Back to Nature by Magazine, Dave Formula's piano is very obviously imitating what Mike Garson was doing on Aladdin Sane. Here are your friends again, inching in the bedroom door. Sort of atonal piano, very obviously evoking the same kind of insanity and fragmentation that you get as major Bowie themes. People like Gary Newman, it's so obvious, you know, that I was never really into, I was into Ultravox, not really into Gary Newman per se. But definitely, when I heard those Bowie-esque inflections in the new wave records that were coming out, that was what turned me on to getting into post-punk. Certainly in Joy Division, you can hear more Iggy Pop in Joy Division simply because of the timbre of Curtis's voice being more Iggy-esque. Also really got into those early Iggy records. I mean, the Idiot and Lust for Life particularly. And I did meet Iggy Pop once. This is my The closest I got to meeting Bowie was meeting Iggy Pop in Paris. I was up in the Place du Tertre in 1996. I lived there. My apartment was right there. I'd been downtown, bought a printer, and I was coming back with the printer under my arm. And suddenly I saw three of the sketch artists who work in the square walking backwards and sketching somebody while walking backwards. And I thought, that's really unusual. Who are they sketching? And I saw that it was this diminutive figure who was Iggy Pop. So I just went up to him. Normally I would be too shy, but it was just such a surprise. And also because we were two Anglophones in Paris, I thought maybe he'd be keen to speak English. I went up and said, "Hey, Iggy, what are you doing here?" And he said, "I come here. I have friends here." And he just sort of kept walking, and I went back to my flat and set up my printer. I've bought things like New Values. I think that was the last Iggy Pop record I bought. I'm not a huge Iggy fan. So I suppose after buying Heroes, I then go back and buy Low. So my association with listening to Low is being at the astricaled windows of my 9 Drummond Place house in Edinburgh. I'm a schoolboy in pretty much my second last year of school, looking out at the mist over the gardens, Drummond Place gardens, and there's a sort of strange church tower in the background. And it's a place heavy with the myths of Hugh McDermott and people like that area of Edinburgh. But in my case, I associate it with blue, electric blue. That's the colour of my room where I will live, and all that sort of almost Zen-like emptiness, which is in the Low lyrics. So somebody who's really come to a place of nothingness. After all the dramatic fragmentation and the lizard-like changes of colour, you get this kind of revelation of an emptiness at the centre of it all, and a solitude as well, drifting into my solitude over my head. So I could identify with that. I think I have a similarly schizoid personality to Mr. Bowie, Mr. Jones, and he was very much channeling Syd Barrett, as usual, using someone else's voice to voice his own inner concerns and perhaps inner void. Of course, Syd Barrett by that time was very much an empty place, a silence, a central void. So those are really the records that struck me hardest. And when Lodger came out, that was also very important. Lodger is the first really global statement. It's a statement of... I think it comes, in a sense, I was thinking about this recently, it comes out of the clothes. Bowie is a clothes horse in some ways, and Ola Hudson designed the clothes for his stage tour, 1978 tour, where he's sort of evoking Errol Flynn in the South China Sea, and wearing these baggy, he's the sailor, he assumes the role of the sailor with a sailor's hat and baggy white pants, and of a lot of plastic, transparent plastic or leather trousers, and kind of Hollywood 1930s swashbuckling shirts with loose sleeves, Japanese-style loose sleeves. All this put together by Ola Hudson, who's Slash from Guns N' Roses' mother, the guitarist of Guns N' Roses, who's a black woman that Bowie was dating in the 70s, and also did his costumes for that tour. So it's almost as if the songs on Lodger are content for the window dressing of that costume. And he has enough global experience. He's thinking about going to live in Japan at this point, and so he's singing about, in songs like Move On, these are the lines he's writing for this character, the sailor. Sometimes I feel the need to move on, so I pack a bag and might catch a train or sail at dawn, or in Red Sails, he's singing about, red sails, make me sail away. It's just the sense of eternal motion, as if you're, instead of shedding skins via personae, you're assuming new personae by going from one city to the other. So he sings about Cyprus, Russia, Africa, Japan. Kyoto gets mentioned. Spent some nights in old Kyoto, sleeping on the matted ground. Here I am on the matted ground. As usual, I become one of the many potential characters that Bowie throws up. Many of us have assumed have continued these possibilities far beyond where he took them. He only lived in Berlin essentially for 1 year, The only, of the so-called Berlin trilogy, the only one that's actually recorded in Berlin is Heroes. The others were recorded in France or Switzerland. So I lived in Berlin for 8 years. Bowie just lived there for 1 year. I have come to live in Japan. Bowie just thought about it and bottled it at the last moment. I lived in New York. Bowie spent all his adult life essentially in New York after the 70s. Los Angeles, Mystique in Switzerland as well, it's true. But it's in a way I feel that in many senses I'm living out potentialities. And now when I do this cabaret act, I'm kind of simply living. I'm all there is left amongst the living of Bowie. Me and all the other people, the thousands of other artists who've been influenced by him, and the listeners who've been influenced by him. And I'm not really going to talk about beyond the 70s, except for this record, the Bal record, which is tremendously important for me because of that whispering style that you get in The Drowned Girl, and also the influence of Bertolt Brecht. That becomes a key influence on my subsequent career as Momus. But I will just remember that when The Cracked Actor came on TV, and I was watching it with both my parents, and my parents have never really liked or accepted David Bowie, or they think it's a kind of ongoing disaster that he was influenced by me, that I was influenced so much by him. So when he died, my mother was reading her newspaper, The Daily Telegraph, and was so annoyed that there were 8 pages devoted in the Telegraph to David Bowie, this worthless person in her estimation. And she just sat there saying, Nicholas has just copied all this, the Moorfields Eye Hospital, Japan, Berlin, just everything that Nicholas has done, making pop records, was done before him by this David Bowie fellow, and it's just a tragic waste of potential. But sitting watching Cracked Actor and seeing the succession of record sleeves and the sound of the Bowie song, and then the narrator, Alan Yentob, sort of making it official. It was tremendously unusual in the 70s to have a documentary about a music artist at all, especially a current music artist. You might get The Birth of the Blues and Robert Johnson on Arena or something, but to get a whole film, a 1-hour film about one music artist's work, was kind of incredible. And it really was the most exciting experience I've ever had watching television, just sitting there with your parents thinking, are they going to get it? Are they going to respect him more now? And actually, of course, they don't. What my mother does is she just says, oh, the way he pronounces his words is so terrible, and why does he keep sniffing, I hope they don't stop us, Obviously a cocaine sniff. So, as usual, my parents focused on the breaches of etiquette in their view anyway. He was not a respectable, estimable person. But there you are. Yeah, he was the most exciting template of a creative animal, a sort of engaged modern creator who was using the modern means of communication, all the electronic media, to make an artwork in public, performance artwork. So it really culminates. I mean, I think there were basically a series of disappointments after that, which lasted 2 decades at least. The dreadfulness of the Tonight album, the mediocrity of the Never Let Me Down album, the desperate attempts to get back its mojo with Tin Machine and all the rest of it. I mean, that's another story, really. I just wanted to talk today about the reason that I do these Dybbuk cabarets, which I'm about to start doing again, and to think about the man who pops up in my dreams pretty much every night as some kind of weird avatar, a shaman, a shamanesque figure who is now a dying shaman in my dreams, who is... I finally left the stage of denial, and I'm now in this stage of sort of weary acceptance, but it's a slow process of bereavement, essentially, and grieving.
Open University.
The one we all believed in. Everybody's scuttling and everybody's nervous. The man who makes the lightning has gone missing in the forest. And on the television comes the evil Nicky Dancho, who proclaims himself the regent, even though he is a rat. He He's got forward sweeping eyebrows, an awful fearless forehead, and the scroll that he is holding tells the future of the world. And all the while the spider comet hurtles towards Earth, a pink and white calamity with an icy blue eye.